We're going to talk about group functions, also known as aggregate functions. These are functions that look at a group of rows and they give you one result. So the important thing about an aggregate function or a group function is where before we saw something that we could select in each row, now it's processing going down, processing a whole bunch of rows within a column. So a couple of things that we have to do that are going to be a little different than the row functions, mostly because of that, because we're selecting in the vertical direction and we're getting one result for many rows. And two new sections we're going to be looking at in the select clause. I've been showing this throughout the semester. We haven't really talked about the group by or the having clauses in the select. So we're going to talk more about those with this lecture, because we're going to have to use the group by and the having to do some of the special stuff that we have to do because we're selecting on the in the vertical direction. So it's not as straightforward as the rows going across horizontally. So I'm going to show you a real simple example here of an aggregate function. This is the distinct. You may have used this in the past. Typically you would use distinct if you wanted to return only the records, each record only one time. So basically in this query that you see, it's going to select the publisher, and for example, it's going to select Pearson first, then McGraw-Hill, then Breton, then Goodhart, Wilcox. But then when it gets to Pearson again, it's not going to display it a second time because it already displayed it one time. So distinct is an aggregate function in that it's going to take into account all of these rows, or I'm sorry, each value within the row in the column that we're selecting. So in this case, you can see we end up with just Pearson one time, even though it was three times in the initial query. So distinct is distinct is a little different than some of the other ones I'm going to show you in that you can list multiple comma delineated columns and it'll still work. It'll just expand that distinct operator across the whole select. So this is a little bit different, this one, but it's a very basic example. The rest of these look more like the functions we were using last week. So in this example, I select the sum of the cost of all my books. So essentially this select statement will take all of the rows that are returned in the select statement. So it'll look at each row, find the cost, and give me the sum of all the costs. So you can start to see here that where before we would have multiple rows. So normally if you selected 7 rows, you're going to get 7 rows. With an aggregate clause, even though you're selecting 7 rows, you only get one result. We just get that 1045. We don't get each price. So we only see one thing. So it's not as straightforward as using the row functions or really any other select where we see one record for each return result. We can also combine columns when we do a aggregate function. So here I'm just giving you a slightly more involved example where we're going to get the profit by subtracting the cost from the retail. So this should give us the profit for each book. So the way Oracle would process this is it would calculate each row, get a total, and it would keep doing that until it gets all the way to the end, and then it combines them all into a sum. So in this case, our sum is $914.80. So the combined profit of all of our books are $914.80. I could also get the average. So this might be a little more useful than the sum. Normally we probably wouldn't, sum has, there's a time and a place to use the sum function, but in that example that I gave you, perhaps average would make a little more sense. Maybe we want to get the average profit for each book. So first, we might calculate the average cost of all the books. So in this case, if I were just doing the cost, I would get $1.35 as the average cost of all my books. But just like the previous example, I can combine the two. I could do retail minus cost, so I can figure out the actual average first, or I'm sorry, the actual profit first. Then after I go through and get the profit, then Oracle's going to give me the average, which in this case is 117.97. So the average profit of each book in my database is 117.97. We can also figure out what the minimum is. So, for example, the minimum cost is 25 cents. So that's the minimum cost, our cost for a book, and then maybe the maximum cost is 185. And you can also combine, as you can see in my example there, I'm combining the max and the average. I'm going to show you that in just a minute. And last, under our standard functions, we have aggregate functions. We've got a count. And count's pretty straightforward. All it's going to do is count all of our records. So if I do count star from books, it's going to count every record in my table, and I get the answer 7. Now if I did a count star from books where publisher is not equal to Pearson, then I would have 3 less than 7. I would have 4. So in this case, if I tried to do select star, comma, publisher, the idea here is, you would think intuitively that if I'm selecting the count and the publisher, that I'm going to get the count for each publisher. It's going to tell me how many books I have from, or how many titles that I carry from each publisher. If you were to try this the way you see it here, you would get an error message in Oracle. You can see here it says not a single group function. So I have to add a group by to my query. In this case, we're going to do a group by publisher. So first it's going to group all of the columns that are the same for publisher. In this case, the Pearsons would all get grouped, and then McGraw-Hill is a group of all of its own. Bretton's a group all of its own. But it's going to group them together and then give me a count. So now, with my results, I can easily see I've got 1 title from Bretton, 3 titles from Pearson, 1 from Harcourt, 1 from McGraw-Hill, etc., etc. You can use the group by with all of the group functions that I've showed you so far. So you would typically use these for average and min and max and things like that. So lots of places you could use that, but basically group by is anytime you wanted to get more than 1 column in an aggregate function, chances are you're going to have to use a group by. You could also use subqueries, which we're going to talk about in the next section, but typically it's going to call for a group by. So for example, if I wanted to select the average cost per publisher, so I want to know, the average profit. So first, that average that you see there, retail minus cost, is profit. So I'm going to get the average profit, and then I'm going to group it by publisher. So I'll be able to see what the average profit is by publisher. So you can see now at a glance, I can see that the highest profit is Goodhart Wilcox, and the lowest profit is U.S. Navy. Now I could also add a having clause. So we're used to using a where clause when we want to restrict rows. So up until now, if we wanted to restrict rows, we added some condition to the where. But with a aggregate clause, you can't use the where. You can't use an aggregate function in a where clause. You have to use a having clause for aggregate functions. And likewise, you can't use a standard condition in a having clause. So anytime you have an aggregate condition, you have to put it in the having clause. So in this case, I have having an average profit that's greater than 0. So that should filter out the U.S. Navy. And there we go. So now we have the books that we expect to get back. So anybody that has a profit that's greater than nothing, or 0, I should say. So again, having is the equivalent of a where clause for aggregate functions. We can also nest our aggregate functions. So for example, let's say I've got an average retail cost. So my average profit from books is really 116.71. So my average profit across all of my titles, if I take the profit of each title and then I average it, I get 116.71. So that's my average by title. But let's say I wanted to find out what's the average profit by publisher, because I want to figure out which publisher averages a higher profit as opposed to just by books what averages a higher profit. And the answer is going to be a little different, because a Pearson has 3 different books, so that's going to change their average a little bit. So the way I would do that is I do my select on the sum of the retail cost. So first I'm going to sum the retail cost, or I'm sorry, sum the profit. So I'm going to get the sum of the profit, and then I'm going to average that. And I have to group by publisher. So basically, anytime you have an aggregate clause, or I'm sorry, an aggregate function that's nested within another aggregate function, as you see here, you have to use the group by, because you have to tell Oracle which one do you want to group by in the outer function. So again, first it's going to do the sum, then it's going to get the average for each one, and it's going to do that by publisher. So you can see for Pearson, I get 339.2 as an overall, and then here is my my numbers for everyone else. And when we average that, we get 155.62. So 155 is a bit more. So my average publisher profit is 155.62, whereas my average title profit is only 116. And the reason it's higher now is because Pearson has higher profit. They have three different titles in my database, so I see more profit in their group. Finally, we're going to talk about statistical functions. And these can be a little hard to wrap your head around. Up until now, most of these make a lot of sense. They're intuitive to everyone. We know what a min, a max, a sum, average. We all know how we would use those. But if you haven't taken a whole lot of statistics, there are a couple statistics terms that we probably need to talk about a little bit. But first, let's talk about how we might use statistics. So take, for example, I have a little line here, and let's say that most of my values. So I plotted on my lined graph here, or my little number line. I plotted the values of maybe the prices of something. So let's say this is the prices of some kind of widget. And if you look at this, you can see that a lot of the prices sort of cluster around certain values. So I've got a couple outliers. So I've got a couple values that are sort of drifted to the outside, to the peripheral. But for the most part, a large percentage of my values are in that center area. They're all clustered together. And basically, when we talk about standard deviation, we're trying to calculate what is the percentage of values that cluster within 70%. So, for example, whatever the width is of that little shadowed area I put on here, about 70% of my values fall within that width. And that width that you see there, that's shaded, is the standard deviation. So if you have a smaller standard deviation, you've got tighter clustering, for the most part, tighter clustering of your values. And that sort of helps you get rid of the outliers, the peripheral values that might throw off an average. Because if you have an average, let's say everything you have is $10, but then one item, let's say you have 100 items that are $10 and one item is $100,000. That one item that's $100,000 is going to really throw off your averages. But the standard deviation tells you that that 70% of your items fall within a certain value. So that you've got, it sort of lets you filter out those outliers. And it also gives you a sense of how clustered your data points are. So, for example, if I were to add additional data points on this chart, on this line, this number line, and I recalculated my standard deviation, obviously my standard deviation is going to get much larger, because now my clustering is those dots that are outside that initial clustering are pulling out that standard deviation outside that initial range. So let's see how we could do this with Oracle. Well, before we talk about exactly how to do this with Oracle, I'm just going to give you a quick lesson on, and this is a very, very basic statistics lesson. Obviously, if you would, you could take a whole semester on statistics and learn all about this stuff, but how do we get to the standard deviation mathematically? So let's say for Pearson, we wanted to get the standard deviation of their profit. So first I calculate the profit, and we know what the average is already. We know the average is going to be, I think it's around 116 or something like that. Or actually it's 113. So 113 is our is our average. But now we want to see how tightly clustered together those averages are, or the actual numbers are. So we want to get a sense. So the standard deviation again is going to give us a sense of how clustered our values are, and if there are any, if there's a lot of outlying. Is are my values all kind of evenly spread out between the min and the max, or is there a min and the max that's an outlier, but most of the values are tightly clustered around the average? So the first thing I'm going to show you is roughly where these numbers would fall on our number line. So this isn't to scale, but this might be roughly where those numbers fall. So the first thing I need to calculate is something called the variance. The variance is basically you take the distance from the average. So you take your average and you subtract it from the actual value, and then you square that. So to the power of 2. So for example, 138 minus 113.7 is going to give me roughly 24, and I square 24. And then the same thing for 93.3, I get 19.8, and I square that one. And then for 89, again, that one's about 24. So what you kind of should get a sense of here is that the standard deviation should show us that there's more clustering below the average than there is above the average. But in any event, so the first thing, to get our variance, we have to add all these together. So if I add all that up, if I take the distance to the average, I add them all up, I get 519.5. So that's my variance. My variance is 519.5. If I wanted to get a variance, if I wanted to arrive at the variance in Oracle without having to go and manually calculate all this, you can do that. So there is a function to get the variance, which is just the word variance, and then you just supply as an argument all the values that you're looking for. So that's the variance. But then to get the standard deviation, the way we arrive at the standard deviation mathematically is you take the square root of the variance, which in this case would be 22, and that would give you your standard deviation. And again, in Oracle, there is a way to do that. You just do standard deviation, or STD DEV. You pass in your profit in this case, and select the table, and it would give you the standard deviation without having to find the variance first. So you wouldn't really need to get the variance. I don't think it's really typical that people would look at the variance, but perhaps it's useful in some cases. But in any event, so what does that 22 tell us? That 22 tells us that that most of our values are going to fall within that range. So if I were looking at this data, if somebody told me that the average price is 113, but the standard deviation is 22, that tells me that most of the values, so a vast majority of my numbers, are going to be either plus or minus 11 from $113. So that's where most of my stuff is going to fall. And there could be some outliers outside that, but that tells me that the vast majority of it's going to be, so if I see a value that's outside that, then I kind of know that that's an outlier, that it's either a little high or a little low based on the averages. And that's basically it. So we talked about a bunch of different functions that we can use, how to group those together. So that if we wanted to select multiple columns in our, if we wanted to group by a certain value, talked about how to restrict by using the having clause. And nesting these together. One thing I forgot to mention about nesting is you can only nest 2 aggregate functions. So you can't do any more than 2 aggregate functions in a single select that are nested. You can have more than that in your select statement that are not nested, but you can only have 2 nested. So one nested inside a second one. Any more than that, it won't work. And then we talked about statistical functions. In this case, we really just discussed standard deviation and variance.